Welcome to LOA Today. Walt Thiessen and life coach Tom Wells here. Today is Friday, March 16th, 2018, 8 a.m. Eastern Time. Your first daily dose of happy for this wonderful Friday. And it's been a wonderful week. Every single day has been great. We've had good podcasts, and I'm not kidding. Every single day has been great. Yeah, it's been really good. And, of course, every week is good, but, you know, this is the week we're in right now, so this is the one that's really good.
I love it.
Yeah.
You know what I always thought was so funny, or not always, but in the last years especially since being involved with Abraham, but even before that, when people say they had a bad day, I always think, how could the whole day
Yeah, right.
be bad? I mean, didn't you have anything good? I mean, and yet, of course, when you're depressed, that could happen. But I think it's an old cliche in the society when people decide to label their whole day bad just because something didn't go right, or isn't that, I think it's a psychological turn people make that's kind of like fatal, like why they start thinking of it as ruined by some one event or something.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean,
and then their day gets made by one good event, right?
Yeah, right. Well, hopefully, if it can be made by one good event, that's usually a great turnaround right there. Most people don't even get that far. They just get hung up on the bad events. But I was responding to a post on Facebook today. It was I believe it was a woman who had posted, she works in the medical field, and she'd had a bad day, and it had been a really rough day, you know, lots of rough things happening. And so I wrote back to her something to the effect of, well, the good news is you're in control of your own feelings about it. You're not dependent upon what happened in the day. You get to decide what's going to happen and what your reaction is going to be to what happened. So if, for example, if someone's dying, you can choose to focus on the fact that they're dying, or you can choose to focus on the fact that they're alive right now.
Uh-huh.
If there's a problem that came your way and somebody was complaining, you can focus on the complaint, or you can choose to focus on the solution to the complaint. It's entirely up to us what we focus on at any given moment. So even the stuff that we call bad, it just depends on how we decide to look at it.
Yeah, and that's why our topic today, the subject of death or croaking or whatever you want to call it, is so much the exact same thing, which is mind-blowing when you think about it. It's just, in a sense, one reason I kind of wanted to do this show today, even though it's in a sort of taboo topic, like, oh, don't talk to me about that. Oh my God, that's the last thing I want to talk about. There's a part of me that feels that way, and then I wonder if listeners, they said, oh, Tom and Walt are going to talk about death. It's like, I think I'll pass on that podcast, but it's so funny because it's the exact same thing. It's like, well, it's just our attitude. And yet we could be cultivating an attitude of resilience and hope and possibility around death, rather than a sense of finality and endedness. And then, of course, the worse than that is the morbidity that society through centuries has put around death, that it's just an absolute morbid, horrible thing, and therefore avoided at all costs. And in a sense, but I think each of us has to ask ourselves, am I running from it? Am I terrified of it? Because if that's the case, or I just absolutely hate to even have the subject anywhere around me, then it's like I feel maybe we're in denial of the fact that it's going to happen to all of us, and not only all of us, but to everything that comes alive goes through the same transition. That maybe,
I love what Abraham has to say about death, or specifically about croaking. They love the word croak. Yeah, and the reason they love the word croak is because it's so disrespectful. Right. It's so disrespectful. It's so disrespectful of death. And they like that because they want us to lighten up about death.
Totally.
They want us to remember that we are non-physical beings who came into a physical world, and while in the physical world, we were both physical and non-physical, contrary to what most humans tend to believe, that we were once non-physical and then we become physical. No, we actually remain non-physical when we're also physical. And then after the physical part ends, we continue to be non-physical. So we're non-physical throughout. It's like there's a continuity there that never ends. And therefore, death is not like the end of everything. It's actually a pretty joyous thing. In fact, there's a really interesting thing that happened in our own family. Louise's stepmother, Ruth, died, let's see, when did she die? It was a year ago, in the summer. It was 2 summers ago, I believe.
Uh-huh.
And we went to visit her literally a day or two before she died. She knew she was going to die. She was pretty old. She was like in her 90s, I think. And she had decided that she didn't want to keep putting up with the medications and so forth. So she had ordered her medications ended, and she knew that meant the end was going to be really close. So we went to visit her, and it was sad because obviously it's saying goodbye and so forth. But I remember vividly what my last comment to her was as we left. And it was a pointed comment because I knew her own beliefs about spirituality and so forth were fairly limited. And she was kind of facing what, from her point of view, was a difficult thing. After we'd said goodbye and we're getting ready to walk out, Louise is actually already walking out. And I'm like passing the foot of the bed, and I turn to her and I say, with a smile on my face, "You got a really exciting adventure coming." And she gave me this quizzical look. And that was the last thing I said to her, and I walked out of the room. Now, we don't think of it that way, do we? But it really is an adventure. There is an adventure about what's coming afterward. Because all the reports that we've gotten from people who have some sort of psychic ability or whatever is that the moment of death and the reemergence into being just pure non-physical is an extremely joyous moment. I mean, it's like this huge celebration that goes on. I remember when my father died. My father died 10 years ago on Monday. And a few days afterward, my sister, who does have some psychic ability she's developed, got a message from him. And when she finally realized it was him, well, the way she got the message was she got a headache. And in the course of getting this headache, it was like a severe migraine type headache, which she never gets. She had enough training from learning how to develop your psychic ability and so forth to recognize this may have been a contact. So she said her first thought was, obviously, Dad had died just a few days ago. So, Dad, is that you? And she got back, yes, almost instantly. And so my sister had tremendous presence of mind. She said, "What's it like on the other side?" Now, Dad just passed, right? What's the first question that comes to her mind? What's it like on the other side? And the answer that came back was festive. And festive has two meanings for me. First of all, it's a happy thing. It's like there's a celebration going on. And the second thing is that I call it a dad word because I don't think my sister has ever used the word festive in her life before that particular time. It's just, she was a theater major. She's more dramatic. She would be saying, awesome, fantastic, amazing. That would be the kind of stuff she'd talk about. Festive, that's not a sister word. That's not my sister's word at all, but it's definitely my dad's word. My dad would definitely give a speech saying, on this festive occasion. That would definitely be my dad. So I knew it was my dad that way. So, here's a little evidence, just one more little tiny piece, that when he passed over, it was great. There was a wonderful thing that happened on the other side.
That's beautiful. I want to give a shout out to everybody who is in our listening audience who is perhaps going through something with death, with either a loved one or in your own physical experience, because I do want to acknowledge that we're not making so much fun of death that we don't respect. In fact, we're not sitting here saying that this whole show is about making fun of death, but I want to let you know that we understand the deep feelings that people have for their loved ones, and that when someone passes, there is often a sadness and a great feeling of heaviness in one's heart, because you love that person so much. So there's no way that I want to diminish that appreciation that we have of others who are passing or have passed, and to minimize that amount of wonderful feeling or deep feeling that we have. And at the same time, to hopefully this show is to help all of us feel maybe we can relax a little bit about the seriousness about it and realize that, as you were saying, Walt, that we are eternal beings here in physical bodies, and that when we pass, as Abraham said, it's no different than simply closing your eyes when you go to sleep and opening them in the other realm, and that other realm, and there's no real drama and trauma about it. There's often drama and trauma that takes place right before we die, right? I mean, if a person dies in a violent way or they're suffering in a great deal of pain, of course, it's nothing to, laugh about or in any way, trivialize. But on the other hand, it is nevertheless, once that transition is made, according to everything that these non-physical beings are telling us, it's a wonderful, wonderful festive occasion, as you say.
Which is not what we normally believe, is it? That's not what we've been taught. That's not what our society tends to believe in. And you're right, that does create a gigantic contrast to what our normal experiences. And for a lot of people, losing a loved one is really rough. There is no doubt about it. I do remember one thing that happened, though, in conjunction with that same death of Louise's stepmother, that I think is really poignant and helpful to people who are going through the pain. And it's really a good piece of information to use if you're helping somebody else who's going through the pain. It's harder when you're doing it yourself, but you can still do it yourself, too. It's just easier to help somebody else with this particular technique I'm going to describe. It's not really a technique, it's just a thing to do. But when we focus on somebody who has passed, and we do it in a way that makes us feel sad and really depressed and maybe even crying and screaming and kicking our feet like, oh, how could this person be gone? It's just not fair, all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. When that happens, it happens and our reactions occur because we're focusing on the loss. Right? We're focusing on the fact that that person is no longer here in the physical life. And we're treating that as, this is my personal loss. This is a loss that is huge to me. And therefore, I feel pain. I feel anger. I feel depression. I feel all the horrible things. Louise was going through that with the passing of her stepmother. And she had, it was a few days after, she was just having a really, really tough time at one point. And without even thinking about it, this was no plan of mine. I just kind of went and did it. I just went over to where she was. She was sitting on the couch. I actually sat down on the floor in front of where she was. And I looked her in the eye, like square on, right? And I said to her, I never really asked you this, but what did you love most about Ruth? And I tell you, within 5 seconds, her entire face changed because she hadn't been thinking about the love. She'd been thinking about the loss. Loss isn't love. Loss is an entirely different realm from love. And just by getting her to focus on the love, and she started telling me about what she loved about Ruth, you could just see the stress just drip away from her body. I mean, literally, within seconds, all of a sudden she was feeling better, and she was getting excited and animated and talking about stuff. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that all of the grief passed, because it does take a little time to get rid of the grief. Some people, it takes a lot of time because they spend so much time on the loss. But the point is, that's your route out. That's how you work your way out of the grief, by focusing on the love, by remembering the love, by thinking about the love, and by recognizing that the love never stops, just as the being never stops. The only thing that stopped was the physical experience, and that was it.
I notice how many times when someone is in the chair and speaking to Abraham, how Abraham will quickly go to the fact that the person is not gone. And they want the person who has had the loss to understand that it's not, nothing has really changed. In fact, the person is closer. And I always think, well, that's got to be kind of hard to fully accept that if you don't feel like you can communicate with the person, you don't feel like you've developed that psychic ability. And yet it's, something they focus on a lot. I had a friend who made really good friends with her neighbor across the street and his little daughter. And she really enjoyed the company of this man and his little daughter. And one night she woke up in the middle of the night and felt something was wrong. And she was having these dreams about things burning, and so many things burning in this dream. And later she got up and she looked out her window, and across the street there was just fire engines, and the house had burned down where this man and his daughter lived, and both of them had died. And she was just devastated, because here she had the dream, and perhaps she could have saved their lives had she gone to the window at that time, but she didn't have any reason to go to the window. And then she just was devastated. She loved this man, she loved his daughter, and she felt that perhaps she could have saved their lives. And she was going through this great, great grieving. I think the next night, in her bed the next day. She just couldn't do anything. And she looked up at one point, and this man was standing at the end of her bed, and he was grinning from ear to ear, she said. And he said he just wanted to let you know that everything's fine. Me and my daughter, we're wonderful. Everything's great. Don't worry about us at all. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing.
That's quite an experience, yeah, because clearly she had found a reason to feel some guilt over the way the whole thing transpired, because she didn't call the fire department. That meant she did something wrong or something like that, right?
Yeah,
and it's so easy.
Yeah, and just
so
the
easy
love
to fall
she had for them.
Yeah, the love was powerful. The love was huge. So to have that loss, and she had in her mind created the idea that, I could have fixed this. I could have solved that. It's my fault. It's my fault. Well, it may not really have been her fault, but the point is, it was building in her mind that way. And just refocusing on the fact that there was basically his spiritual image. And I think that's what we can say that was. It was a specter or whatever you want to call it that was talking to her, and it was very clearly him. It basically changed the subject. It said, no, don't go there. Oh, we're fine. We're just fine. There's no need for you to go down that road.
So, we just have these long-term associations in our society with the fear of it. And I do talk to a number of people in my life now who, when it comes around to death, they really feel that it's something that they don't know anything about, and that there is no proof whatsoever that life goes on. And I'm starting to sort of sense that that's probably, there's quite a bit of prevalence of that belief. Of course, if someone is in a particular religion and they believe that religion has told them there is a heaven, and that's where your husband's waiting for you, your wife's waiting for you, your daughter, whoever has gone ahead of you and everything's going to be wonderful. A lot of people do buy into that too, but it's interesting that I run into a number of people who feel very strongly that you just don't know until it happens. And part of me says, okay, but there is all these near-death experiences, and there is a lot that's been written over many centuries about there being an afterlife of some sort. And of course, I think it's one of the reasons why I appreciate Abraham so much, is because they've helped me to really back off hardly any worry about it. I think there's still part of me that does hold on to some, concern, and I think it's maybe just the part that says, I don't want to really leave this physical plane until I've really given it my all, in the sense of I've milked it for all the joy there is here, because there's really no reason to leave this body until I'm really ready to leave this body.
It's true. The thing that I heard really loudly in what you were saying there was their notion that we don't know until we get there. And I think that's true. I mean, we really don't know, because knowing in most cases means experiencing. And until you experience it, then you truly don't know it. Now, we could talk all we want to about, multiple past lives and so forth, and we've been through it before, but, what's the point if we can't remember it? That doesn't really help us with knowing it now. So, sure, I agree. We don't know it. The real question isn't whether we know it, I don't think. I don't think that actually is relevant at all. Now, they may disagree with me, that's fine, but I really don't think it's relevant. I think the real question is, how do you feel about it? Because if what you're saying is, well, we really don't know, but that's okay, I feel all right about the whole process, well, then great, no big deal. There is no issue going on. But on the other hand, if you feel like, well, we really don't know, and along with that is, and I don't feel real comfortable about the whole subject because, I'm not real happy with the idea of death. Well, that's a different thing. That's a very different thing. So at that point, I'd be asking that person I agree that we don't really know, but what do you think happens? What's your best guess? Or how do you feel about when it happens? And what choices do you make when it happens? How do you handle it? What's your way of handling it? Because really, that's the bottom line. It's like anything else in life. No matter what the event is, it's all about how we decide we're going to respond to it, because we do control our own feelings.
Yeah, and Abraham said that we pass into non-physical when we quit leading our own parade here, and we start falling back in the ranks of the parade and let others lead, and we stop having a stimulation that we're generating about why we want to be here. And he says, and then as we turn our attention more to the non-physical, that's when we make our transition. And he said, each of us chooses when we're going to leave. It's really completely in our control, although it doesn't always seem that way. Obviously, if you lose your daughter and she's 17 years old, it's pretty hard to say your daughter chose that and knew when she was going to leave, and everything is somehow in their control. It seems just more like a terrible tragedy, and that you're the victim of, and that she's the victim of, and that there is some kind of a perpetrator there, whether you call it God or the person who pulled the trigger, or however it happened, the drunk driver that caused that death of that person. And again, I don't want to minimize that tragedy and the fact that a person wants to believe that there are victims and there are perpetrators, but in the larger scheme of things, it somehow could be that each one of us as an individual soul, as an individual eternal infinite being, knows exactly what we're up to every moment of our existence, and our larger self is determining how we're playing this game here on this earth, and when we decide to go, and how much, and how long we decide to stay.
That's a hard concept too. It's a sensitive concept. It's one that it creates a lot of difficulty for a lot of people who have viewpoints and beliefs that have developed throughout their lives that are in conflict with it, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. And so, it creates a lot of difficulty. I've seen people posting on about cases of, horrible things that happen to people, and the comments are always, "Oh, it's not your fault. You didn't attract that. It has nothing to do with you. Things just happen in life and so forth." Mm-hmm. And I understand where that comes from. I understand where that desire comes from that it's all about trying to help the person get through the immediate moment right now and all that kind of thing. I get that. But there is also another flip side to it, and that is it's a kind thing to do, right? To try to help somebody feel better, to say, "Oh no, it wasn't anything that you did," and all that kind of thing. And that is kind. There's a kindness to it. There's also another side to it, and it's a side that never gets attention, and I don't want to even spend a lot of time on it, but the other side of it is that it helps to create a self-deception, and self-deceptions have a way of coming back to haunt us. So I'm always a little bit leery of saying something. In fact, I'm always leery of it. It's not almost always. I am always leery of it. I'm always unwilling to say, well, no, you didn't attract this. I might not say that you attracted it, but I will not say that you did not attract it, because that sets up a false paradigm in people's minds, and they end up leading themselves down the line to all kinds of false conclusions that end up harming themselves in other ways in their lives, not having anything to do with death, just having to do with choices that they make. It's amazing how often, for instance, such people who say, well, there's nothing, you didn't attract or whatever, have trouble when something else happens that's not morbid, that's not mortal, that is just a more mundane thing. And then they have trouble admitting that in that case they attracted it. Mm-hmm. It turns into this ongoing pattern of belief that the only things that we attract are good things. We can't possibly attract anything that's bad. And so we set ourselves up for failure after failure after failure, and we don't understand why. Why is it that every time I try to request something, it doesn't show up? Not realizing that we undermined it with something negative we were focusing on. So that's why I resist going down the road of saying, oh, no. You didn't attract this. I never do that. I think that's really bad for the person in the long run. I won't necessarily say you attracted this, but I definitely will not say you did not attract it.
Yeah. I just try to move conversations toward, is it a vibration based universe or not? And do like vibrations attract like vibrations? And of course, you can't always have any kind of conversation with a person who is feeling like, I'm a victim of this, or she's a victim of it, and therefore don't talk to me about anything else, which is, like you say, people make that choice. It also gives a person a permission to stay in in a belief system that says, like you, I guess it's the same thing you're saying, that being in a sad place, being in a place of grieving, a place of great justification of feeling depressed and feeling overwhelmed with the sadness of life is justified, and that's just a normal thing. And I'm going to stay sad the rest of my life because I lost my daughter, I lost my son, I lost my baby. I mean, and unfortunately, I think some people do stay, it's just something that's very hard to get over. And, I don't want to minimize trauma. It can be just devastating. And yet,
oh yeah,
is it really the way? Ultimately, it seems like at some point a person has to say, is this the way I want to live? Do I really want to stay in this place where I reinforce over and over and over and over and over that I lost my child to this tragic car accident and I am not able to leave that place? Or is it really true that you could leave that place of your grieving eventually? It is possible to completely remember the resiliency of life, that the death of that other person was their choice on some level. So we are not completely so wrapped up with each other that we have to stay in grief because someone else had a tragedy. I don't know, it's a very fine line between, it's up to each person totally. And I respect completely each person's decision. But I did see these people on a television program not too long ago who the entire program was about the grief of this married couple who had lost their young daughter in a tragic way. I think it was a car accident. And this was like 10 years afterwards, and they were still crying about it. And and of course the reporter, who did the piece maybe brought all it back to the surface, but I could tell from the whole show that they had spent those 10 years in great, great sorrow and great grieving. And wow, I thought that's intense, to have so many years of your life where you're living almost entirely for the fact that you lost this loved one.
Yeah, you're stuck in it, really. That's a place of being stuck. And
yeah, but you could never say that to somebody's face. You would never want to.
It would almost take a therapist to do something like that.
It
would almost take a therapist to do something like that, I think. I'm thinking of our colleague Joel Elston, who is a therapist and who does exactly that kind of thing. He even posted. Well, this wasn't about death, but it's related. You can tell as soon as you hear what it is. He was posting about children, young people, and in his post he says, "Robbing young people the benefit of struggle is stealing their future, because struggle forges character. It even builds empires. Reinforcing your child's victim mindset robs them of their future and robs society of their potential." Well, the same thing is true of everybody else. It's not just children. I mean, the victimhood mentality is a mentality that robs the victim of life. It robs them of their wonderful existence here in the physical plane. And staying in that space for 10 years at a time, the more that you stay there, the more you're undermining your own life. It's really important to move off of it as soon as you can. So, yeah, I agree with you. Reinforcing victimhood, that's one of the few things that I start to get upset about. Because when I see somebody who just is reinforcing victimhood for somebody else, my hardest thing is to calm myself down and say, please don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I even know people who, for example, they just feel so victimized, say, by the government, or they feel so victimized by, what's happening with the environment or something, and the way that people treat animals and things, and they are literally, their whole life is caught up in the angst and the drama and the pain of, say, what dogs suffer, or what, who we have in the White House. It's just so painful to them that they are posting about it constantly on Facebook. They are talking about it constantly. And they really, when you hang out with them, you see they just have lost so much of their zest for life because they feel like they can't be happy if that thing is going on. The same way a person could choose they can't be happy if they lost a loved one, especially that losing a loved one before the time of that person, feeling like it was a premature death. But it's the same question, like at what point do we say, is my happiness in this body, in this lifetime, worth more somehow, my own individual happiness worth more than my grieving and my angst and my anger? And could I actually do more to even help the situation? I notice how Abraham, when they get somebody in the chair who's so sad about losing a loved one, it's often a mother who's lost a son or a father who's lost a child, and yet they almost always turn that person towards the fact that person has not left. That this thing we call death is not what you think it is. It's not this huge veil of tears, that it's this giant chasm that's now exists between you and that person. They said this person is right here with you. They are closer to you now than ever. And if you want to, you can get in touch with them, but you've got to decide you want to be in touch with them. And yet that seems so painful because we identify so much with the physical form of things that we don't want to believe in the unseen realm, and I love how sometimes a person who's grieving like that, they'll read one of these books about someone who's had this near-death experience, or they've died on the operating table and gone through this amazing experience going to the light through this great tunnel, and they've had this experience of joy that is just off the charts. And then they're brought back into their body, and they're never the same from then on. They live their lives with such gusto and such love because they've seen that being here in this body is just wonderful, and that there's nothing to fear about going to the other side. And this person who's been grieving so much about losing their loved one suddenly sees, oh, I guess I can back off all this angst. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so cool when that happens, because they, in a way, it's like I've been wanting to do out of body experiences because the people who do that out of body travel say that's what happens. You get this experience is so incredible that you see that being here is awesome. That you're not living to be in that other realm.
I think probably too the most important thing, whether you do it through out of body experience. I mean, for me, that's not really a big thing, but for other people like you, it is, and that's fine.
Well, but I don't know I'm a little worried about doing it. I haven't done it yet.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, maybe
well,
not.
Because I was reading this thing where Abraham said that you leave this realm when you turn your attention to the non-physical.
Oh,
That's when you leave this realm. And I'm thinking, if I'm focusing a bunch on wanting to experience the non-physical, I could just end up leaving this realm. But
not necessarily. I mean, because when we look on our inner being and we talk to our inner being is non-physical. Well, we're focusing on non-physical at that point. That's so right. What? It's not, okay, I'm going to focus on my inner being. I'm dead. No. That's not the way it works.
Well, I'm doing it to get more gusto for life, actually, because I have had the experience at my age where going into my 70s, I'm like, I've had more experience of feeling the presence of death. It seems like the older I get, the more I'm aware that, well, it's going to happen, and so I want to be, and I think I've sort of run out in my life to some extent of the gusto I had, because when I lose my ability to do the more exciting things I've done in my life because I physically just can't do them as much anymore, then my mind starts to drift towards moving on. It wants to be in the gusto. I really want to be in the gusto. Mm-hmm. And so going into the non-physical realm, the people that I'm reading who have done that, they really understand about gusto. They understand about a zest for life. And that's all I'm really looking for. But they say it's an incredible adventure to be on the other side of this divide between what we call physical and non-physical. It's really awesome. But I would want to do it in order to come back here and have more enthusiasm to play music, more enthusiasm to have loving relationships, more enthusiasm to go into the mountains or down to the ocean, or whatever, turns me on. That's what I want to live for. I want to live for the zest of life.
I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Last of the Blonde Bombshells starring Judi Dench. If you haven't, I recommend it. It's a wonderful movie. It'll just cheer you right up no matter what.
Cool.
But it's the story of a woman who, at the beginning of the movie begins with the death of her husband. She's at the funeral for her husband. And at that funeral, well, a couple things happened, including one thing that proves to be funny later on. At it's actually not a funeral, it's a memorial service. And at the memorial service, they play some of his favorite music. And his favorite music was Gilbert and Sullivan. And I can't quote exactly what she said because we try to avoid swearing here on the program. So I'll rephrase it a little bit. But she's sitting there kind of sadly listening to this, and one of her children, or I guess it's her granddaughter, leans to her and says, is this making you sad? And she says, no, I hate this bleeping tune. But then shortly after that, she's still sitting in the memorial service hall, and her family, her children are outside. They're trying to figure out how quickly to move her out because there's another service coming in immediately afterward. Apparently they do the one every 20 minutes in this place and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure to get out of there. But she's still sitting in there. Her granddaughter volunteers to go in to get her, sits down next to her, and Judi Dench's character turns to her granddaughter and says, Joanna, can I ask you something? Can I ask you for some advice? And her granddaughter, who's very young, says, well, I'll try. And she says, what's the best way to show respect for the dead? And her granddaughter says, that's easy. You go on living. And Judi Dench's character says, that's right. And they get up and leave the memorial service hall. And that's probably the most important thing to remember. What's the best way to show respect for the dead? What's the best way to love the dead? Keep living.
Yeah.
In fact, the more time that we spend not living, staying in depression, staying in that bad place, and insisting on focusing on the loss, is disrespectful to the dead. I mean, we don't want to think about it that way because the pain is so strong, the suffering is so strong. But truly, someone who's passed on, can you think of anybody in your life who passed on who would say, I want you to be so sad that I died?
Yeah, right.
Nobody's going to say that. You'd have to be a really monstrous person to say, I want you to suffer the rest of your life because I died. Right. So no one who passed on wanted you to feel that way. They didn't want you to stay in that place. So, of course, it's important to live. It's important to not just live, but to live joyously, because that's what they want for us.
Right. And you really, when you think about it, you don't judge life. Well, I don't want to judge anything, but you don't evaluate life by quantity of years lived. It's by quality of years lived.
That's right.
So, it's the joy that really is the whole reason we're playing the game of coming here and being in this physical existence. And I was looking at the topics of all of our other shows, other than the one we're doing now on death, and every other show is about life. It's about living joyously. So you look at every topic that we've picked for every podcast that you and I have done, and I'm sure every podcast that's done on the LOA today is about getting to the point where you have more enthusiasm for life, for the joy of living. Mm-hmm. And that's really all we're, in a sense, doing here every day. I think about this entire day ahead of me. All I'm doing is every second asking myself in a certain way, I'm doing this, am I enjoying this? Am I having fun? Am I looking at something that's going on right now and putting a pall of seriousness over intensity, fear, worry, anxiety, whatever, about what's coming next? Or am I thinking I'm not enough of something, or I'm not happy enough? I mean, any kind of judgment and blame or shame. And the same is true of somebody who's grieving, or someone who doesn't believe that there's an afterlife or whatever. It's like, we're never wrong for anything we're doing. The only question always comes back to, are we making that little turn towards joy? Are we relaxing and choosing to be in total forgiveness and acceptance and enthusiasm for the fact that life is meant to be a joyous adventure? Right.
I've always been an admirer of the way that they conduct funerals in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Do you know what I mean? Right. Because what they do is, they have the funeral, and after the funeral, their little jazz band that's at the funeral will play the funeral dirge, and then after playing the funeral dirge, at the end of it, the trombone will go bwah, and then they'll kick into some high-paced, excited New Orleans jazz type of tune, and it becomes a dancing celebration thing.
Right.
And I always thought, whoa, what a great idea it is to do that.
Yeah.
Because
the difference between a funeral and a wake,
That's right. Yeah. A difference between a funeral and a celebration is really what it is.
Yeah. My sister had cystic fibrosis, and she was the youngest one in the family, and she fought cystic fibrosis her whole adult life. She was kind of okay up till her late teens, and she was going skiing and even tried drugs, and she eventually even met a man, and they adopted a child, but her health started to deteriorate more and more from age 20 on, but she lived to age 36, which was a long time for someone with cystic fibrosis to live.
Sure.
And eventually she'd gotten a liver transplant, and now she needed a lung transplant. She was on oxygen all the time. And finally she just couldn't keep struggling to stay alive. Her body had gotten deformed from all of her that she had been through. It was just suffering. But she was so happy. She was such a resilient, beautiful human being, just a shining. She was very small, and great big lungs, because of just the effort to breathe for her whole life was so hard, so hard. She had such a coughing. Well, okay, she's in the hospital and she's dying, and everybody in the family is there. And I have a family of about 45 members, and everybody's in that hospital room with her.
Wow.
And she's dying, and the nurses are coming in and out, and the hospice workers, and everyone is encouraging her and loving her. And God, it was so beautiful. And finally she takes her last breath, and everybody cheers and just applauds, and all the nurses come,
Wow.
And it was just all down the hall. You just hear this cheering and everything. And they said they've never seen anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. What a powerful experience.
Yeah, it was so beautiful. And then we went home and we just had this, just this party. My dad was crying uncontrollably because he was so close to her. And my mother had passed a year before. And it turns out my sister passed on practically what was it? It was like, I think one day after my mother had passed the year before, and they were so close. The two of them were like peas in a pod, and of course my mother always carried this guilt, that she had given birth to a daughter with cystic fibrosis. But I just felt this incredible beauty, and everybody who was a relative to the family, who was an in-law, they just have said, that I can't believe your family. How could you guys are so in love, with each other and with life, and I thought it was so beautiful that it happened that way. And that our sister had come into that family to somehow live out some of the pain of my family, and then to take it out of the family in a way. She carried it in her body. And when she died, there was a certain freedom that came in the family, So
wow, I give your family a lot of credit for that one. That was just phenomenal that they had the presence of mind to celebrate the passing that way. That was just really great. I mean, seriously, that was a fantastic thing. And it's not something that most people are able to do in that moment. So kudos to your family for being open enough to be able to do that. That is a remarkably good example. Remarkable good example.
Yeah, I think that's really the way it is for all of us. And I don't know. We just, tragedy is so, it's accepted. It's just like the same way that I live my life every day. And I believe, part of me has believed so much in the fact that it's difficult. It's hard, and it's a struggle. And I'm just constantly shedding that, constantly saying, I don't want to live in the belief that it's hard. Like I'm giving a speech today at my Toastmasters speech club, and they say that the only thing worse than death that people fear is giving a public speech.
So you're going to suffer a little death today. Is that the idea?
Exactly. And it's true, and as I've been rehearsing it, I say, why there's so much, like drama around wanting to do this right. And it's the same sort of feeling, and what I keep realizing is I'm only doing this speech and I'm only in this Toastmasters Club because I want to have fun. It's really only because I want to communicate love and joy to people. And it's so funny that I would, and I have to keep reminding myself that that's the thing people want to see when I get up in front of them. They don't want to see a guy struggling to give a good speech. They want to see a guy happily giving a good speech.
True.
They want to see a guy joyfully, up there. And if he makes a few mistakes, so what? The thing they want to see is his innocence and his resilience and his joy.
That's right. Sure. Oh yeah.
And that's all I want to experience. And I've said that even to people at the Toastmasters Club. I said, I'm only here because I want to have a good time giving speeches.
Yes. Very good. Very, very good. When you told the story of your passing of your sister there, it reminded me of what happened when my dad passed. Because I told you how my sister got that psychic message from him. Well, that psychic message had a really profound effect. But there were two things going on here, because my dad's death had kind of been prolonged. My dad suffered from Parkinson's disease. And I don't want to go into graphic detail, but I'll tell you that over time what happens with Parkinson's is that, among other things, it gets into the throat and prevents you from swallowing, so you can't eat food, so you starve to death. And I won't go any further than that. But the point is, you can imagine it was not really pleasant watching my father go through that. And I actually wasn't right nearby. I lived a couple of hours north. It was my mother and my sister who were there for most of it. But that's pretty rough to go through that. So when he passed, it was a relief. It's not like a situation where there was this accident that happened and, how could that possibly have happened, and came out of the blue. It was a complete surprise, all that kind of thing. We knew it was coming, but it was like this long, drawn-out, painful thing. And I got to tell you, Tom, during that time period, that's when I did my grieving. I was so upset for my father having to go through all that pain, the suffering. He was going through some really bad suffering. At the time of his passing, the suffering ended. The suffering was done. And I felt such relief. It was the most amazing thing to me that afterward I didn't have any more grief yet. I had done all my grieving before he died. And, that's not the way you're supposed to do it, right? You're supposed to do your grieving after the person dies, not before. But that's not the way it was. So if you can imagine this, we had the memorial service after he passed. And here we have my mother, my sister, myself, my brother, my niece, and my wife were all in the little room next to where the sanctuary is in the church where they had the memorial service. And the minister is there with us, right? And we're having this conversation. And we were about 10 minutes into it, and it finally dawned on me why we were in that room. It hadn't occurred to me at all. It finally dawned on me. He was there to console us. And none of us needed consoling. He was. You could see it on his face. He was the most confused person in the universe at that point, because he knew what his role was, and he had nowhere to do it. There was no opportunity to console anybody because nobody was feeling grief.
Ah, wow.
And the funniest part was...
Well, kudos to you guys.
Well, yeah. Well, it was because of the nature of the way my dad passed. Yeah. But, we go into the sanctuary after that, and we're sitting down in the front pew, and he's up there, and he's giving his eulogy and so forth. And in the midst of it, he made this commentary about how impressive my father's impact on our lives were, because he had taught us so well how to have such strong faith, how to have this, this amazing level of faith. And I'm sitting there trying very hard not to snigger, because I hadn't been to church in years. My wife, not the same deal. My brother hadn't been to church in years. My sister went occasionally. My mom went more often. I mean, we were not like your typical faithful churchgoers. And here he is praising this huge amount of faith we had. And I'm just thinking, the people here have no idea how ironic this is.
That's great.
I mean, it was surreal. It was, and the best part after that. They have their little fellowship hall there, where they have that's the get together with the food and celebrating the life, and there's like the slideshow of my dad and all that kind of stuff. So we're in there, and all these people in the church are coming up to us and trying to console us, tell us how wonderful he was and how much he's going to be missed and so forth. Yeah. And what it turned into is we were consoling them. I can't tell you how surreal that felt. You know what the strangest part of the whole thing was? At one point, they were playing music that my dad liked, right now in this part of the slideshow. And at one point, a swing tune was playing. Well, my wife and I and my brother are all swing dancers. So my brother starts swing dancing with my wife in the middle of the fellowship hall, in the middle of this gathering to mourn the passing of my father. Oh,
yeah,
just completely surreal. But to my mind, it also shows a much more healthy way to deal with death, because we get to choose how we're going to feel about it. It isn't something where we have to feel horrible. We really have a choice.
Right. Yeah. To feel that heaviness, is that heaviness is just, but I mean, that shaman I worked with, who was part of this huge village in Guatemala, Mayan village, he said that in that village, that when someone passed, there was massive grieving and everybody got into it. But I think, in a sense, the way he described it, it was almost like ritualistic. It had a life of its own, and the village just dealt with it by following almost like this ritual pattern where they grieved and they grieved and they grieved, and then it was over. So in a sense, there was that festive atmosphere in a certain way around it. And I guess every culture has their different traditions too,
sure.
And the way they handle it. But I think it is pretty individual, ultimately, as to how each of us decides. Because I know when my mother and my father both passed, I felt a little bit guilty because I kind of felt like I was one of the only ones in the room who wasn't very heavied out by it. I was just kind of like, okay. And I had this, like I've said before, this teacher from India since I was 23 years old, who I had been following for 40 years, and he always indicated that death was not a big deal. And so I wouldn't say that's totally true. He actually said, that he actually made death seem kind of final, but he did it because he wanted you to understand how life is so important, that it's really important to enjoy your life while you're here, because it is a limited amount of time you get. But that didn't acknowledge the fact that there was eternal life, in a sense, that there is nothing to be worried about. It's just a very simple transition. But I feel guilty, but I realize, well, that's just how I feel inside. I'm not freaked out about the fact they've moved on. I'm kind of okay with it.
That's a good place. That's a good place to be, because when we're in that place, then we can move on. Because that's really what we're trying to do. Those of us who are still alive, who have lost a loved one, we're trying to move on. That's the ultimate hope, that somehow the pain will pass, the grief will pass, and we'll be able to get on with our lives. The only time that we really truly stumble with it, because sometimes we just have to cry the grief out. That's just the nature of it. But we don't want to stay living in it. That's where we get trapped. People like you were describing, I don't remember the story, but you were describing somebody who was trapped in grief for years. I think you said 10 years, loss of a child, I think it was. Yeah. And if you stay in that grief for years, you're living a horror. You're just plain living a horror, and it never goes away. It kind of reminds me of a client that Joel told me about that had come in, who had been in therapy for 15 years with a therapist who was convinced that even though she didn't recognize it consciously, she had been sexually abused as a child. Mm-hmm. And so for years they had been trying to get at the root of, well, what can you remember? How did you feel? All that kind of stuff. And largely the person couldn't remember any of it, but she had bought into this idea that she had been sexually abused as a child. Now, sexual abuse is horrible. Let's not mince any words here. Sexual abuse, particularly of a innocent child, is a terrible, terrible thing. And we don't really know. Joel doesn't even know whether it actually happened. Hopefully, it didn't. But the point is, for 15 years, she'd been focusing on it. And so Joel's very, very first question to her, after she told him the story, was, "So are you done?" Mm-hmm. Because at some point you got to be done.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the horror goes on. And you know what catches my attention more than anything else about that story is it would be really horrible if the event actually happened. But you know what's even more horrible? is if she lived those 15 years and the event didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because then she was traumatized for 15 years over something that never actually happened.
Yeah.
Well, is that any different from somebody who does have an event happen and they continue to live in the grief of it endlessly? Isn't it true that they are also traumatizing themselves?
Yeah. Yeah. And
that's the real trauma as far as I'm concerned.
They can make any choice they want. I think each individual is totally free. I think the thing with law of attraction that, the reason for this podcast is that, in law of attraction, we're saying to ourselves and to others, you do have a choice as to where you want your focus to be. And you're not completely at the mercy of these things. Now, as long as we feel heavy feelings, my friend who's a Jungian analyst, she would say, I think that, you've got to deal with letting this feeling in your heart be felt and fully experienced, of the grief you're feeling, of the sadness and the pain that you're feeling, until you're no longer feeling it, or and maybe it'll never go away. Maybe you're going to feel some of that the rest of your life. But law of attraction would say, and I think so would a Jungian analyst, is that at some point you want to choose life because you're here, and because life is a precious commodity, and the quality of joy that you feel in your heart will largely determine the quality of life experience you're going to have. So it's your choice, Ultimately, you might need to grieve, and you might need to hold the extreme pain that you felt from that trauma for as long as you need to hold it. But at some point, you do have the choice to move on, right?
Yeah, at some point, you have the choice to let go of it. Just as you have the choice to hold on to it, you also have the choice to let go of it. So it really comes down to one question. How long do you want to hang on to it? Or more precisely, when are you willing to let go of it?
Right. And when are you willing to put your focus on to the thing that you would prefer to be feeling in your life?
Which is what it really takes. That's how you really let go of something. You don't do it by just saying, well, I just let go. That doesn't work. You do it by living, by taking on life again. And that's really what the message that Joanna, the daughter of the granddaughter of the character that Judi Dench was playing, was telling her. It's all about choosing life.
Mm-hmm.
We get to choose life. If we choose life, that's how we climb out.
Mm-hmm. And I think that as I grow older, and I know that what I want to feel on my deathbed, quote unquote, is I want to feel the same, that I'm making the same choice that I'm making every day, which is I'm choosing to live. I'm choosing to feel awesome about life. Like one way I heard Abraham describe it, they said, some people, they just come to a point where they say, here's what the words they said. Let's see. Whether it's someone who's been bipping along in their physical existence, who's been meditating, who knows the sweetness of connection on a day-to-day basis, who then says, this life experience has been so wonderful, and I think I will now turn my attention to another aspect of my life experience, closes their eyes as they put themselves in the bed, makes their transition during the night, and they're discovered as having made their transition in the morning, or whether they have some violent experience at the hand of an enemy or a gun or something, or a car crash, and they make their transition. Either way, it's ultimately the same experience. So, I like when they said, if it's a person who says, I now turn my attention to another aspect of my life experience. So in a way, death doesn't exist. It's just when you go from this side of the veil or whatever it is to the other side, you're just going to another aspect of your life. And so I don't know the point I was making, but this is definitely
I think that is the point. I think
it's an eternal experience. This experience we're having here, there isn't a big deal about death. That's what they're saying. It's really not a big deal.
It's not, no. And it doesn't need to be a big deal. So we really, once again, have the choice, and that's the good news. Unfortunately, we have to kind of leave it there because we're a little bit over on time. But Tom, I'm glad that you brought this topic up. This is a good one, and I hope that you have a great weekend. And let's do it again on Monday because we get to do it all over again.
Thank you all. All right, appreciate it.
All right, we'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.